Missed my cue. Hi everybody, welcome back to Avalon Rising. Tonight's headline speaker is Ian Crane. It's going to be a 3-hour set with a half-hour musical interlude. So without further ado, I will hand you over.
Thanks very much. What a great venue, great location. And, you know, a few firsts. It's the first time I think I've given a talk with a backing track. And you know, I've had a few people fall asleep in my presentations before, but they were never lying down. So anyway, hopefully I can keep you awake as we go through. So yeah, as was said in the introduction, I'm going to do this in 2 halves. And we'll keep each half to around about 75 minutes or so. What I would ask is that if you have any questions, keep them to the very end, because I've got a lot of material I want to get through, and it may well be that if you have a question, I'm actually going to answer it anyway as we go through. I'm going to cover a lot of ground, so by definition, I'm not necessarily going to go into every aspect in great depth, and that's where maybe the questions, you know, will come through. And I'm really glad I had an opportunity to see Steve's talk earlier this afternoon, because it's truly remarkable how so many people are researching so many different subjects and yet all coming up with very, very similar conjecture of what is unfolding before us. Now, I'm going to focus through the course of the evening for 95% of the talk on the deep geopolitical arena. And this is an area where a lot of people say, oh my God, aren't you sort of creating fear? Well, if you haven't been through the fear, then the answer is yes, you will go through fear. It's absolutely critical that at some juncture in the journey, you go through fear. You have to understand that, you know, what is occurring here is so far beyond the bounds of most people's perception that once they realize the magnitude of the lies, the deceit, the obfuscation, the deception, sure, the realization and the awakening brings on fear, and then anger. Sometimes, actually, those are switched around. Sometimes the anger comes before the fear. But it's like all things, it's a lot easier to deal with. It's a lot easier to find a path through when you actually know what's going on. So I'm sure that as we go through the evening, there's going to be a lot that I touch on that you're going to be aware of. But hopefully, you know, I'm also going to give you some insights that you may not be aware of. But before I get into the presentation proper, how many people here are aware of Edge Media TV on Sky Channel 200? Excellent, a good number. Well, we're struggling to keep it alive. It's on free to air, and funnily enough, because of the nature of the material that we broadcast, we don't have too many mainstream advertisers wanting to promote their wares on our channel. So we're trying to find new ways of generating revenues to keep the channel alive. I mean, if I told you how much it costs just to keep the channel on the air, then you know, you'd probably have a minor coronary. It certainly gives me one every month trying to find the money. But fortunately, we've got a couple of benefactors who are helping us keep it on air, but they don't have an unlimited pot of money, and they certainly don't have unlimited patience. So we do have to find ways. So as part of the evening, if you do have some coins or notes to spare, can you maybe consider contributing to the Edge Media Rescue Fund? And if you don't want to do it today, you can always go online to Edge Media Rescue or emtvrescue.co.uk, because this is material that is absolutely critical. I mean, Ofcom are desperately trying to shut us, Channel 201, 203, and Russia Today. They're trying to shut us all down because we're actually starting to attract viewers. The BBC, ITV, Channel 4, they're losing viewers as people start to realize that actually what they're propagating is a crock of crap. I mean, who would have ever believed 30 years ago that we'd be tuning into a Russian TV station to get the truth? It's a bit outrageous, really, isn't it? So, you know, we have pretty much an uphill battle on our hands, but, you know, I believe that with the appropriate support and guidance, you know, we'll find our way through. So let's get into the presentation. Let's kick off with something that was topical anyway a couple of weeks ago.
breaking news on News Corp. The media conglomerate is shutting down its News of the World UK tabloid.
At this hour, we really don't know just how far reaching the scandal that rocked Rupert Murdoch's media empire will be.
Some inspired casting there from Lisa and John, who put that video together, and thanks to them for letting me use it as my intro. This is one of the signs that there are increasing battles between those who think they are part of the inner sanctum of the rightful rulers, or those who believe themselves to be the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom. And what I'll show you through the course of the evening is that we've had some events over the last, certainly, decade that have been geared at manipulating public opinion. And now what we're starting to see are events that are geared to manipulate government policy. And I'm going to give you a very different take on some events that have occurred in recent months. And when I show you the dots that join together, which of course you're not going to see in the mainstream media, it will give a completely different perspective of things. And this was an absolute brilliant masterstroke by Murdoch to shut down the News of the World. You know, from the moment they realised the magnitude of the deep doo-doo that they were in, the shut it down was masterful. Because by shutting down the paper the following Sunday, after the scandal broke, the following Sunday was July the 10th, so, what, barely 3 weeks ago, once you shut down a business, the only thing you need to retain are the financial records. Everything else can be trashed. So you can bet your bottom dollar that the moment that this edition of the News of the World was put to bed, the phones, the laptops were all probably taken in and they are being wiped clean. Of course, the paper copies, they can just be burned. The only thing that needs to be kept are the financial records. So I think that Murdoch realised, or Murdoch and Mick Hucknall, they realised that, you know, basically if the magnitude of the phone hacking really got out, then, you know, it might be a lot worse. So damage limitation here just shut down the News of the World. And phone hacking's been going on for a long time, of course. I mean, you don't have to think that far back. You remember Prince Charles, Camilla Parker Bowles and a tampon? Yeah, you remember that? All because of phone hacking, but no big deal at the time, but all of a sudden it becomes, you know, front page news. And there's another agenda here, that's for sure, and I know from some of my contacts in the police that they are very concerned about what may unfold here as a result of this, because the police certainly rely on their informal contacts with the media, and there's no question, of course, that you know, there's been corruption and abuse with those relationships, but they're concerned that what may come out of this is literally a situation where the police have to log even the most casual meeting with a journalist and actually log what was discussed, what was said, and you know, thereby literally establishing central control. So this still has some legs to play out. But it's also a distraction. It's a distraction from other stuff that's perhaps more important, as we'll see. But another factor here, of course, barely a couple of weeks ago, Sean Hoare, the guy who broke the phone hacking scandal to the New York Times in September of last year, or that certainly broke the magnitude of the scandal, is found dead in his apartment 10 days ago. He's found on July the 18th. And remarkably, the Hertfordshire police, who were called to the scene, within 30 minutes, they said that his death was unexplained but not suspicious. You know, within half an hour of finding the body. Well, remarkably, this guy is believed to have died the day before on July the 17th and found on July the 18th. And this is an incredible coincidence, but this guy died on July the 17th, 2003, and was found on July the 18th. So maybe, you know, July the 17th, there's buy one, get one free. Is there anybody here, by the way, anybody here who believes that David Kelly committed suicide? No, I didn't think so. I mean, this is, again, it links into what Steve was saying earlier. You know, it doesn't really matter how many public inquiries they have into the death of Princess Diana, into David Kelly, or into the events of 7/7. Primarily, people know the truth. They know the truth. They know it in their heart. Okay, once they start to dig and the evidence emerges, then that intuition is validated. But in reality, it really doesn't matter how many times we're told that he didn't, or that he did commit suicide. We'll know the truth. So what we're also seeing, of course, is things unfold within News Corps. And, you know, even the day after they appeared before the Parliamentary Committee, former employees of the News of the World were coming forward and saying, hang on a goddamn second, you know, actually there is a completely different version of events than the one that was presented to the Parliamentary Committee. And I watched that hearing, and it was pathetic, absolutely pathetic. You know, the hard questions really weren't being asked. They really didn't put either James Murdoch or Rebecca Wade under any great pressure. And that's, I believe, part of their brief. Meanwhile, though, and the Daily Mail called it absolutely correct, the real scandal the MPs ignore as Murdoch's grilling turns to farce, and that was being related, of course, to the custard pie. I mean, once again, how the hell, with all the security in Westminster, how the hell does a guy get a comic custard pie through security? Unbelievable. It's more like a setup here, but it certainly provided opportunity to take the real mess off the front pages and focus on this. And she moved so quickly that either she has lightning reactions or she knew something was going to happen. But this, the real issue, the bankers get £14 billion bonuses, and the IMF warns of the euro meltdown. And one of the journalists who I certainly have a lot of respect for is Christopher Booker. I mean, I think that this guy has been truly outstanding over the last 20-odd years, and often it really does hit the nub. Here, the euro now threatens the world with economic meltdown. I mean, this should have been on the front pages, and the Murdoch situation should have been, you know, page 3 or 5 or whatever. But of course, it's the other way around. And Booker is absolutely right. He says, while Britain has seemingly been transfixed by Murdoch Gate, rolling down on us all like a tsunami, interesting choice of words, is a crisis so immeasurably greater that by comparison it makes the misdemeanors of a few journalists, policemen and politicians look quite irrelevant. And this is exactly the same as a couple of years ago when the MP's expenses scandal, which was deliberately contrived, it was 12 years in the making, but it was deliberately contrived to take all debate about the role of the EU off of the front pages, or out of the media completely, in the run-up to the general election. Because the real debate should have been how much power was being handed over to Brussels, not basically MPs' expenses, which, you know, came to barely £1 million in the scheme of things. I'm not condoning it for one moment, but in the bigger picture, it's really microscopic. So the title of this talk is The Shift, because I think, you know, we can all see, wherever we're sitting, that something is happening. And we're all looking at it perhaps from different perspectives. And like I said, Steve's presentation earlier was a superb lead-in to this. But it's the shift is about to hit the fan. Because if you think things have been accelerating at a rate of knots, which they certainly have been, you ain't seen nothing yet. And the whole idea is to accelerate things at such a phenomenon that people just can't keep up with it. So they go, ah! I don't want to know. I don't want to know. I don't want to talk about it. Which then gives these guys the opportunity to accelerate the agenda even further. And we'll take a look as we go through at what that agenda really is. So I'm going to focus really very much on the last 15 months. Because 15 months ago, on April the 20th, this event occurred. And I had a very, very deep sense of foreboding on April the 19th of last year. In fact, on April the 19th of last year, I was sitting in a hotel room in Lisbon, where I was stranded on my way back from Mozambique, where I'd been down to visit my daughter, who works as a diving instructor there, mainly so that she doesn't have to pay back her student loan. And I was stuck in Lisbon because of a supposed volcanic cloud that was blocking the skies of northern Europe. You'll remember those days because they were the clearest skies we've seen in a decade. And I had a real strong sense that something was about to happen. I don't claim any special insight here, I simply read the scripts. Because April the 19th stroke 20th, in the belief system of those who think they are the rightful rulers of the planet, is the day of sacrifice by fire. I don't have to go back too far. April the 19th, 1995, well, sorry, 93, let's go back to 93, because 93 was the attack by the Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms team on the Waco complex of David Koresh, where some 70, 80 people were killed, many of them young children, burned to death because they were in the basement, and the firestorm was started by the Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms. 2 years later, supposedly Timothy McVeigh, the lone gunman, and the events of April the 19th, 1995 bear a remarkable similarity to the events just a couple of weeks ago in Norway. We'll talk about that a little later, where Timothy McVeigh supposedly set off a fertilizer truck bomb which blew up the Alfred P. Murrah building in Oklahoma City, supposedly as a revenge attack on the Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms division. The only concern is that there was nobody from the Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms division in at work that morning, and the building collapsed on a nursery. So the vast majority of those who were killed in the Alfred P. Murrah bombing were young children who'd been dropped off at the nursery on the first floor. Let's roll the clock forward to 1999. We have the Columbine High School massacre. This is April 19th, April 20th. And then, of course, we have Hitler's birthday, by the way. Hitler's birthday on April 20th, the Queen's birthday on April 20th, and the current Pope was appointed into office on April the 19th as well. This is the day of sacrifice by fire. And invariably, not every year, but invariably, every few years, something of great significance occurs. And I had this real strong sense of foreboding. I'd had it before. I don't have the time to go into that, but it was prior to a presentation I gave in Chicago, which the local news picked up on, and nothing happened. But a few days after I gave the presentation, a terror team was arrested in Florida with detailed plans based on exactly the same scenario that I had presented at this conference in Chicago. And I had exactly the same gut feeling sitting in this hotel in Lisbon last year that something was about to happen. Now, when it happened, and of course I didn't pick this up until the morning of April 21st, because the rig blew, the well blew, at 9:20 in the evening on April 20th. And initially I didn't want to believe that this was the event that I'd written about, because I'd sent a newsletter out on the evening of April the 19th saying, you know, we've got to be really, really vigilant because something is about to happen. I didn't want to believe it because I spent 20 years in the oil industry working with a company called Schlumberger, and I didn't want to believe that my former colleagues in the oil industry would be party to perpetrating such an event. And I was even speaking at a deep geopolitics conference in California in mid-May, and even at that event I still was holding back from saying that this was a contrived event because I was missing a couple of key pieces of information. But after I came back from California on May the 19th, the final piece of the jigsaw emerged, and I knew beyond any shadow of doubt that this was indeed a contrived event. Now I'm just going to give you a very short version of that and explain why I know it was a contrived event, because these are the guys, so this guy here is a BP company man on a rig. The company man is the head honcho. This guy, Ronald Sepulvado, was the most experienced BP company man in the fleet on the BP Deepwater horizon. He was taken off the rig on April the 16th, 4 days before the explosion. Now, he was trying to explain why he was taken off the rig before the Gulf Coast hearing last year, but he was a little bit embarrassed because he was really saying, look, I was told I had to attend this course. And the course that he had to attend was on the safe operation of the blowout preventer. Why would the most experienced company man in the BP fleet be told to go on a course on the safe operation of the blowout preventer at exactly the moment of criticality on the rig when the blowout preventer would come into its own? Well, he can't answer that question because he was just simply following orders. So he handed over to a guy called Bob Kaluza. Now, Bob Kaluza is a very inexperienced company man. In fact, he'd never worked on an offshore rig before. 32 years of age, no offshore experience, and he's put in charge over this guy who'd been on the rig for 6 months. He's effectively the senior company man, and this is the guy who, in my opinion, was put on the rig to make it happen. The key piece of information here is that my former company, Schlumberger, were on the rig. They had 2 engineers on the rig, and they were on the rig to run what's called the cement bond log. The cement bond log is the final test to determine the integrity of the cementing operation in the casing before signing the well off to go into production. The Schlumberger engineers knew something was wrong. They knew that the cement casing wasn't holding. I won't bore you with all the details of that. But they told the company man, Bob Kaluza, they told him that the well was unsafe and the well was about to blow and it needed to be shut in immediately. Now, let me tell you, when Schlumberger advise a company man that a well needs to be shut in, he doesn't hesitate. He immediately follows their instructions. Because Schlumberger are the gold standard in the oil industry. You pay, well, the oil companies pay an enormous amount of money to have a Schlumberger engineer on the rig. If they think they can get away with a lesser service, they will. They'll only bring Schlumberger when they absolutely know they need the gold standard. This is the first time ever that a company man has ignored a Schlumberger engineer's advice. It doesn't happen very often because the engineer himself knows that if he makes a wrong call, his career is over. He will never, ever be permitted on a rig again if he makes a wrong call. So it's not something that a Schlumberger engineer does lightly. But in this case, they were absolutely convinced, and the reason being was because they were running a test which showed that the casing of the well was kicking, which means it's vibrating. And when a well is kicking at this stage, it ain't going to get any better, it's only going to get worse. So they knew it was going to blow. When Kaluza told them that he wasn't going to shut the well in, the Schlumberger engineers knew what was going to happen and they wanted to get off that rig real quick. There was no scheduled helicopter, so they called their manager. The 2 Schlumberger engineers called their manager in New Orleans. Every manager in Schlumberger has worked the rig, so he doesn't need to have it explained to him in words of one syllable. He knew exactly what was going down here. The Schlumberger manager immediately chartered a helicopter, had it flown out to the rig, and took the Schlumberger engineers off the rig at 11 o'clock in the morning of April the 20th. 10 hours later, boom, the rig blows. Now, I released a DVD talking about this in much greater detail. I released it in August of last year. It's been on Amazon since September of last year. It took me until February to be able to persuade Amazon to make the DVD available even on their own search engine. So even if you Googled or put into their Amazon search engine, Ian Crane BP, you couldn't find the DVD. Wonder why that is. For the same reason that you can't find any photographs of these guys on the web, because BP have managed to remove all traces of these 2 guys from the rig. Now, I actually found photographs of these guys about 3 weeks before I gave the presentation, which was recorded on July 23rd last year. But I didn't think for 1 minute that BP would remove them, so I didn't actually save them at that point. But when I went back 10 days later, gone. And I've made this observation at pretty much every presentation I've given on this subject over the last year, which is well over 100 times, and nobody has managed to come up with a photograph of either Bob Kaluza or Donald Verdring. Now, if I'm wrong, assertion that this guy was put on the rig to make it happen, of course BP should be suing me for libel. Well, this guy should be suing me for libel. But they won't, because they daren't draw attention to that DVD. They know that if they draw attention to my assertion, they run the risk of this gaining legs. Why isn't it taking traction? Well, I'll show you why it's not taking traction in the Gulf in just a little while. Because a few days, in fact 3 weeks before I gave the presentation that I recorded and eventually became the DVD, BP, population reduction and the end of an age, there was a hearing in the Senate. And this hearing in the Senate was to discuss whether or not the Gulf Coast hearing should be given the power of subpoena. The power of subpoena means that they could demand that these guys turn up. Why did they need the power of subpoena? Because Bob Kaluza has pleaded the Fifth. By pleading the Fifth Amendment, of course, it means that if he does give evidence, there's a distinct likelihood that the evidence that he gives may well incriminate him. No shit. So he's pleaded the Fifth, and this guy is sick. So neither of them has given evidence before the Gulf Coast hearing. So on June the 30th last year, the Senate took a vote. It was the third reading of the request to give the power of subpoena to the Gulf Coast hearing. Now, it had been through the House of Representatives, and in the House of Representatives it was passed by 420 votes to 1. 420 to 1. Now, interestingly, the 1 was Ron Paul. For those of you who know anything about US politics, that's quite a remarkable situation. But nonetheless, Ron Paul voted against it. So it went to the Senate. And this was the third reading in the Senate. Just take a look at this short clip.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Judiciary Committee be discharged of S-3462, a bill to provide subpoena power to the National Commission on the British Petroleum Oil Spill in the Gulf of Mexico, and that the Senate then proceed to its consideration.
Is there objection?
On behalf of other members of the Republican Conference, I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President?
Senator from New Hampshire.
President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 442 H.R. 5481, a bill to give subpoena power to the National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill and offshore drilling, that the bill be read a third time and passed, and the motion to consider be laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate. This is legislation that passed the House 420 to 1.
Is there objection?
On behalf of other members of the Republican Conference, I object.
The objection is heard.
Madam President,
The Senator from New Hampshire.
I don't understand what is so objectionable. In the House, 169 Republicans voted in favor of giving the Presidential Commission subpoena power. They understand how important that is, because this commission begins their investigation in the next few weeks. This should not be a partisan issue. I don't understand why my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are turning this into a partisan issue. I find it unbelievable that after everything the people of the Gulf region have endured and that this entire country has witnessed for over 2 months now, that anyone is still standing with the oil company that caused this disaster instead of the victims who are suffering from it.
I hope the American people understand that this is a clear contrast between who stands on your side and who stands on the side of special interests. How is it possible that members of this chamber find it difficult when the House of Representatives, in a near unanimous vote, could say that the subpoena powers necessary for the Commission to be able to get to the bottom of what happened could pass unanimously there, save for one vote, and yet cannot even proceed here? Cannot even proceed here. This isn't rocket science. It's common sense to most Americans. We need to fully learn the lessons of this disaster with a thorough investigation, not protect oil companies from having their negligence exposed. We need to get answers from BP and and Halliburton and everyone else, including the federal agencies, not give apologies to them, as I have seen Republicans suggest that we should apologize to BP for making sure that the residents of the Gulf region are held whole. We need to know the truth, and the Commission needs the power to get the truth. So who are you protecting? And what are we hiding here?
What you've just witnessed there is prima facie evidence that the US government is in the grip of global corporatists. That's a long-winded way of saying they are in the grip of a fascist regime. The definition of fascism is a corporate-controlled state. And that is exactly what you have in the US, and that's exactly what you've witnessed. In fact, the Republican that stood up, representing the Republican Party, was Norm Coleman. And the way in which Norm Coleman became a senator is also very interesting, because he replaced a guy called Paul Wellstone. Paul Wellstone was one of the guys who stood up to Bush and Cheney and stated that the war, or the intended war in Iraq, was illegal, and he was killed in a plane crash shortly before the elections. And Norm Coleman was the guy who effectively took over from him. BP pays sufficient money, as does the whole of the hydrocarbons industry. It pays sufficient money in donations to senators and representatives on both sides of the House to make sure that when they need to call in the favours, they'll get called in. So to this day, the BP investigation has no power of subpoena. They will never get to the bottom of what occurred, and that's why they will not run the risk of drawing attention to my DVD presentation, because they know, that I spent 20 years in the oil industry. They cannot dismiss me as a conspiracy theorist. I use information that is in the public domain. I use information that was in the public domain in the immediate aftermath of the event, and some of that is not available today. But it doesn't end there. It gets a lot worse. Around about the same time, this report appeared in the Daily Mail, actually. It appeared in other papers as well, but there was a particular individual in the US who was becoming very vocal and very critical of both BP and the federal government's response to the Deepwater Horizon disaster. And he actually said that some dramatic action needs to be taken, and actually that a limited nuclear device needs to be dropped into the well and exploded to seal the well. Now, this was completely outrageous, and thanks be to God it didn't happen. As far as I'm aware, the only time this has ever happened was in 1973, when the Russians dropped a limited nuclear device down a gas well, and they're still paying the price for that to this day. But the guy who made that recommendation was this guy, a guy called Matthew Simmons. Now, anybody here that is aware of the peak oil construct will know the name Matthew Simmons, because up until 2008, Matthew Simmons was one of the prime movers behind the profile of the peak oil hypothesis. But when the price of oil reached $147 a barrel in July of 2008, Matt Simmons was astute enough to realize that it was indeed a construct, and the whole hypothesis of peak oil had no validity in fact, which I'll touch on a little later. So Matt Simmons, in the immediate aftermath of the price dumping from $147 to $35, decided that he needed to move out of the oil industry. He spent all his career here. It wasn't where he needed to be. He needed to take some other action. So, in fact, he moved out of the oil industry, out of investment banking, and he set up a company called Ocean Energy Institute. And Ocean Energy Institute's motivation was to develop wind farms off of the coast of Maine, Matt Simmons' home state, with the goal of providing all of Maine's electricity from offshore wind farms by the year 2020. At that point, Matt Simmons was no longer a friend of the oil industry. He was a great friend while he was promoting the hypothesis of peak oil, creating the perception of scarcity. But the moment that he moved away and focused on alternative energy sources, he was an enemy of the oil industry. Well, in the aftermath of the BP Deepwater Horizon, he certainly became an enemy big time. After shipping returned to the Gulf on July 25th, because it had been removed from the Gulf, supposedly because of the imminent arrival of Hurricane Storm Bonnie, Matt Simmons spotted something really quite remarkable. Now, I doubt very much whether many of you will be aware of this, but Matt Simmons was absolutely on the money, on the ball here, because what Matt spotted was that in the location of the Deepwater horizon, there was actually 2 wells there. There was 2 wells. They had lost the first well because of over-aggressive drilling, and they'd lost the drill string, and they decided to shut the well in. Now, this has been put forward as one of the reasons why Kaluza didn't want to shut in the second well, because he was aware that BP had already lost the first well, well A. Now, well A was at these coordinates. This is the Lambda coordinates, which is the equivalent of the underwater GPS coordinates of the well. This is the well that was shut in before they started drilling the well that blew out on April 20th. This is the well that blew on April 20th. This is the coordinates. And these are the coordinates that were on the cameras, on the live feeds that were shown on the internet, right up until July 23rd, when all the shipping was removed from the Gulf because of the arrival, or the imminent arrival of Hurricane Storm Bonnie. It never actually materialized. But with all the shipping out of the way, BP suddenly claimed that on July 25th, they had finally lowered what they call the top hat. They'd lowered the top hat onto the well, and it was finally capped. Well, Matt Simmons spotted that the live feed after that date was actually no longer coming from this well, it was coming from this well. So Matt Simmons went on MSNBC and many other US TV channels and said, look, this is another example of BP lying to us and the federal government lying to us. This well hasn't been shut in. This well is still spewing oil, potentially at 100,000 barrels a day. And Matt was extremely critical. And nobody could challenge him because he had the evidence. He had the evidence from the cameras that they were showing well A after July 25th as opposed to well B. So what the cameras were showing was the well that was shut in before they'd even started to drill well B. So Matt Simmons was a real problem for the oil industry and the federal government. On August the 7th, Sunday, August the 7th of last year, Matt Simmons was sitting in his hot tub, alone. It's an outside hot tub, at his house in Maine. And when his family came out to get him at about 10 o'clock in the evening, they found him dead, supposedly of a heart attack. This was a healthy 67-year-old with no history of heart disease. So you can imagine that there is a lot of conjecture that Matt Simmons was taken out of the equation. Also, as a potential warning to anybody else who dare flag up these issues. Matt Simmons was also trying to expose Bob Kaluza as the man who was placed on the rig to make it happen. And in fact, you can Google Matt Simmons, Bob Kaluza, MSNBC, and you can listen to a couple of the radio interviews and TV interviews that he gave, trying to get people to realize that this was indeed a contrived event. Now, after the event, many people will be aware that BP were putting Corexit, an extremely toxic dispersant. And the reason they were pouring this Corexit onto the slick was to make the slick go underwater. Why would they want to do that when the easiest way to clean up the slick is take it off the surface? Well, the reason that they were putting it under the water was because the lawyers got involved. And just like the lawyers telling Murdoch that the smartest thing that he could do is shut down the News of the World so that they can actually destroy all the incriminating evidence of all the phone hacking that had been going on previously, the lawyers at BP said, look, you know, there's an amazing piece of legislation here that says that our liability is calculated based on the visible slick. So how about we make the slick disappear? So BP, at a conservative estimate, have poured at least 100,000 gallons, of this toxic chemical. It's 10 times more toxic than oil. Oil is toxic at 10.2 parts per million. Corexit is toxic at 1.2 parts per million. It's not only been pumped directly into the plumes, it's also been sprayed. And in fact, there have been numerous cases of people becoming extremely sick after swimming in their swimming pools in Florida, particularly in the Panhandle, because the sprayed Corexit has found its way into their pool. So what's happened here is that the Corexit has forced the slick under the surface. So on the surface of the water it looks pristine, but what it's created is a dead zone in the Gulf. Now the Gulf of Mexico used to provide 60% of all seafood to the United States market. Obviously today, basically nobody's buying seafood from the Gulf of Mexico. It's like playing Russian roulette. And in fact, because nobody was buying it, Obama instructed the US military to buy 30,000 tons of Gulf seafood and feed it to the military and sell it through their commissaries to the military families. I mean, it's outrageous, absolutely outrageous. But it gets worse, because there was a fellow researcher in the Gulf in Florida called Michael Edward, and he was increasingly aware of a number of people becoming seriously ill. And he started to collate all of the symptoms, and he nicknamed the illness Blue Plague, BP, Blue Plague. Well, Michael Edward was of the opinion, because of the information that he was getting, he was of the opinion that BP were introducing microbiology into the slick as part of the cleanup process. And he was of the opinion that this microbiology had reached the stage of HGT, which is horizontal gene transfer. In other words, it was starting to cross between species. And the reason that he had this hypothesis was because people who were sick, when they were taking a poo, they could see their poo moving. There was larvae in the poo. And of course, BP were denying this. But then they slipped up, believe it or not, in an interview with Stephen Fry. Now, Stephen Fry, of course, had no idea what the guy was saying. It was only when Michael Edward picked up on this interview that the seriousness of what was admitted here was understood. Take a look at this.
The plume is actually disappearing. The plume is being biodegraded, that there is a new form of microbiology that is attacking this plume and using it as a food source.
Just to bring it back to the...
Sorry. Tight schedule here.
Okay. Thank you.
We have introduced a new form of microbiology, genetically modified microbiology. And you notice that immediately he said it, he was shut down. He was shut down by BP's PR guy, of course, who these companies always have the PR guys, they were the bane of my life, always have the PR guys making sure that the interviewer and the interviewee stay on message. Clearly here, this is Mike Utzler, who was the Chief Operations Officer for the cleanup operation. So if anybody knew what they were talking about, it's this guy. And here was the admission in this interview, which took place in late October, early November last year, that BP have introduced genetically modified microbiology. Now, something remarkable has also occurred with the weather systems, because to date, there has not been a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico since the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster. This is unheard of. Why are there no hurricanes? Well, could it be that the weather is indeed being manipulated, but the reason it's being manipulated is because if there is a hurricane, the oil, Corexit, genetically modified microbiological soup is going to get sucked up into the Gulf Stream and will be deposited across, well, basically the whole of the eastern United States, and eventually, of course, make its way across to Europe, which it may well be already, because it is in the Gulf Stream. And in fact, there is certainly the hypothesis has been put forward by a number of oceanographers and some physicists that one of the reasons that we had an extremely cold winter last year was because of the increased viscosity of the Gulf Stream because of the oil Corexit genetically modified microbiology in the Gulf, and is working its way around out of the Gulf of Mexico and into the Gulf Stream coming across the Atlantic. So I'll tell you what, I'd much rather have a few more cold winters than have this shit washing up on our shores. Because we're already seeing the effects of this in other areas. And anybody who, by the way, anybody who starts to flag up the fact that they are sick and indeed dying, and Michael Edwards is trying to log these cases, and certainly people are dying, they're dying ostensibly from respiratory illness, because the oil Corexit microbiology is in the air, particularly people who live extremely close to the shoreline. And it's just like after 9/11, when the US government declared the air to be clean, but of course it wasn't. So many of the first responders after 9/11 are now dead or dying because of the dust, the nanotechnology that was in the dust has effectively destroyed their lungs. And we're seeing the same thing in the Gulf of Mexico. But anybody who flags it up is a beneficiary of BP's behavioral health payments. Now, this is a euphemism for shut the fuck up. How much, everyone has their price. So you're sick. How much do you need? And any payment, and by the way, you can find this information, it's in the public domain. Any payment that BP make is attached to a confidentiality agreement. So that any individual receiving the payment is not permitted to declare to anybody that they have received that payment, what they've received the payment for, and certainly not for how much. But we do know from BP's own accounts, because they set up a $20 billion fund, they've only paid out $8 billion to date, but 62 million of that is behavioral health. How do we know that this soup is making its way to other parts of the US? This is a photograph of one of the superstorms that hit Missouri, Joplin in Missouri, a few weeks ago. Immediately after this storm, people started to get sick and were dying. And FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, was setting up morgues, schools and churches, and demanding that anybody working in these morgues signed a secrecy confidentiality agreement, because they didn't want it getting out that people were sick and dying following these storms. And of course, the hypothesis that Michael Edwards puts forward is that the symptoms that people are experiencing in Missouri are identical to the symptoms that people are experiencing in the Gulf Coast area. I'll take questions later, because otherwise we'll never get through everything. Questions at the sorry? Whenever the, what was it, April, May? Whenever the storm hit Missouri this year. This is the devastation that it caused. I mean, these weren't normal tornadoes. Normally a tornado, has a footprint that's barely the width of a street. That's why it can literally wipe out a row of houses, but either side the houses are intact. But these things had a footprint that was about half a mile wide. Now, when I put the DVD together last year to talk about this issue, I called it BP, Population Reduction and the End of an Age. And the population reduction part of it is what gives some of the residents of the Gulf Coast the concern. They say, well, no, that's just a conspiracy, But that's what's happening. And not too far away from Florida, we have the Georgia Guidestones in Elbert County, Georgia. Is there anybody here that has never heard of the Georgia Guidestones? Okay, listen, I don't expect you to remember everything that I talk about tonight. And I certainly don't expect you to take anything I say at face value. What I do hope that you will do is actually go away and take a look at some of the things that you do remember for yourself. But if you remember just one thing, remember the Georgia Guidestones. That's Georgia as in the state of Georgia, and Guidestones, one word. This is a megalith that appeared mysteriously in 1982. It's attributed to a mysterious R.C. Christian. A lot of speculation as to who that might or might not be. But what we have here in 8 modern and 8 ancient languages are the goals and objectives of those who think they are the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom. And I'm not going to go through all of those goals and objectives because you can go and look at those for yourself, but I'm going to introduce you to 3 of them. And this is number 1, maintain humanity under 500 million in perpetual balance with nature. Under 500 million. If we're at 7 billion right now, that's a pretty dramatic reduction. Number 2, guide reproduction wisely, improving fitness and diversity. This is eugenics. This is the eugenics agenda. And we are starting to see the whole issue of eugenics creep into public debate. Baroness Warnock in, what would it be, 2008, I think it was? She made a statement, and she said, those with dementia have a duty to die because they are a drain on their family and on the state. What she was doing was introducing the subject of euthanasia. And these guys work on the basis of gradualism. So it's sow the seed. If there's no reaction, you can move forward a little bit more. If there is a reaction, back off a little bit, bide your time, and then advance the agenda again in a little while. Number 10, be not a cancer on the earth, leave room for nature, leave room for nature. Now, we say, okay, well, this is outrageous. I mean, this is just obviously the work of some extremists. But this idea of controlling a planet with a greatly reduced population is really nothing new. Take a look at this. This is the culling of 6 billion humans. And this is in a document that's called Rebuilding America's Defenses. It's produced by an organization called PNAC, the Project for a New American Century. And this particular document was published in September of 2000, exactly 1 year before 9/11. And when you read this document, if you don't know who it is that put it together, you'd think it was a sci-fi document, you know, taking 1984 and Brave New World a few steps forward, and, you know, was probably written by somebody on acid. But when you actually go to the back page and you see the 27 signatories that put their name in the document, you see the likes of Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, Robert Zoellick. Those, 2 of those have been head of the World Bank. Cheney. 10 of the 27 people who put their signatures on that document went straight into George Bush's government in January of 2001. And also in this document on page 51, there is the specific statement that the American public will never support global hegemony, i.e. the US taking control of the planet militarily. There's no way that the American public will support that except in the event of a catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. 1 year later, of course, they got their new Pearl Harbor. On page 60, it says, advanced forms of biological warfare that can target specific genotypes may transform biological warfare from the realm of terror to a politically useful tool. And I'm going to show you that there was an incident a few weeks ago where this was put into practice. So in the hands of the likes of Al-Qaeda, that would be a terror weapon. In the hands of people wearing suits and ties, it's a useful political tool. This is from Prince Philip's book, If I Were an Animal, published in 1986. And this is from the foreword. He wrote, I just wonder what it would be like to be reincarnated in an animal whose species had been so reduced in numbers that it was in danger of extinction. What would be its feelings toward the human species whose population explosion had denied it somewhere to exist? I must confess that I am tempted to ask for reincarnation as a particularly deadly virus. And just in case you thought that was a slip, he basically made exactly the same observation to a German reporter when he was on tour promoting the book. In Texas, Dr. Eric Pianka, professor of zoology, gave a speech just 5 years ago. to the Texas Academy of Science, and during that speech he advocated the need to exterminate 90% of the population through the airborne Ebola virus. He got a standing ovation. So there's a hell of a lot of people out there who believe that the survival of the planet and the survival of the species can only be facilitated by wiping out 90% of humanity. But, you know, one of the things that always amazes me is that those who bang on about overpopulation of the planet, they never volunteer themselves or their families to be the first ones to leave this mortal coil. It's always somebody else. And just in case, you know, you thought that this isn't something that would really ever happen in the UK, something happened in October of last year which belies that fact. And this is, what I'm going to show you here is a promo video that was produced by an organisation called Global 1010. Global 1010. This promo video was directed by Richard Curtis. Now, this is quite graphic, so if you are of a weak disposition, you might want to avert your eyes. But this was a promo that was produced for the Global 1010 campaign, which was to reduce the carbon footprint by 10% by the year 2010. They've now moved on to 2020, which is remove or reduce the carbon footprint by 20% by the year 2020. So 10% by 2010, 20% by 2020. And this was a government-funded promo video.
Right, kids, just before you go, there's a brilliant idea in the air that I'd like to run by you. Now, it's called 10-10. The idea is everyone starts cutting their carbon emissions by 10%, thus keeping the planet safe for everyone, eventually. Now, this hasn't got to be a huge thing, but I would love it if you and your families would think about doing something.
What sort of thing, miss?
Well, like getting your dad to insulate the loft, or taking your next holiday by train instead of flying, or buying energy-saving light bulbs.
We're thinking of using our car less. I'm going to cycle to school.
That's fantastic, Jemima. Now, no pressure at all, but it'd be great to get a sense of how many of you do this, just a rough percentage. That's fantastic! And those not? Philip and Tracy. That's fine, that's absolutely fine. Your own choice. OK, class, thank you so much for today, and I will see you all tomorrow. Oh, just before you go, I just need to press this little button here. Now, everybody, please remember to read chapters 5 and 6 on volcanoes and glaciation. Except for Philip and Tracy, of course.
Right, just want to check on that 10-10 thing. Had some brilliant ideas from lots of you, how the firm can cut down emissions by 10%. Just quick show of hands, everyone who wants to get involved. Great, that's nearly everybody. And, yeah, just for the record, no pressure. Those who aren't quite convinced about it yet, cool, it's no problem, your choice. OK, so those of you planning something here or at home should probably get working on it. Oh, gorgeous. Those of you who aren't, excellent. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Well, hello everyone. It's great to be back here at Spurs. So many happy memories for me. Anyway, tell me something. What is this 10-10 thing the club is doing?
Well, it means that we're trying to cut our carbon emissions by 10% this year. And Tottenham Hotspur Football Club was the first to sign up.
We've changed the floodlights at White Hart Lane, so they're low energy. Lots of our fans are coming to matches on buses, trains, bikes and stuff, rather than coming by car.
I see. Whatever, I wouldn't do it. It seems like distraction from football to me.
That's just fine, David. You don't have to join in. Just ignore it. No pressure. Right, lads. Let's do some penalties.
1010. Hundreds of thousands of people, schools, businesses, hospitals, movie stars, knitting circles, scout troops, presidents and governments, all fighting climate change in more than 40 countries. Care to join us? No pressure. Is that okay?
Sounded great to me. Thanks,
okay.
Gillian.
Happy to help.
So, what are you thinking of doing for 1010 yourself?
What, are you kidding me? I thought that by doing this voiceover, that was my contribution.
Right. No, absolutely. No pressure.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Jesus.
Okay, let's do a straw poll here. How many people are ready to put an effort into saving 10%? No pressure. No pressure. Can we have a show of hands? And those not? No pressure. I'll just get my... Can you imagine if that had been produced, let's say, by Hamas? Right? Or, yeah, or anybody. Richard Curtis. And it was commissioned by Global 1010, which is a government-sponsored charity, all part of the climate change agenda. And as you can see, it was high dollar. You know, Gillian Anderson, David Ginola, Peter Crouch. You know, this was a high dollar production. After 3 days, it was removed, and the head of the Global 1010 organisation who had commissioned it said, oh, people just didn't get the joke. Listen, what we have to understand is that these guys perpetrating the agenda have a completely different belief system than that which they present to the masses. Words are very, very powerful. Very powerful. The phrase carbon footprint is very, very significant. What are we made of? Carbon and water. Carbon. What do? We walk. We walk. When people sign in to reducing carbon footprint in the occult belief system of those who believe themselves to be the rightful ruler of the planet, we are effectively buying in to population reduction. It's very, very significant. Don't underestimate, what is going on here. This is a long-term game. I produced a DVD called Hidden Agenda 2012 5 years ago, and everything I said 5 years ago that would be happening now is starting to manifest. So we have to be very, very careful at what we buy into. Let me tell you that the whole peak oil construct and global warming construct are distractions. I can tell you from the oil industry that there ain't no possibility of hydrocarbons running out anytime soon. Let me also tell you that the alternatives have been available for a long time. There is no way that we need to be extracting 90 million barrels a day, but it's critical to maintaining this facade of an economy. When you consider we're all paying £1.30 something for a litre of fuel, 86 pence of that is tax. You're paying more in tax for a litre of fuel than you were actually paying for a litre of fuel just a few years ago. And even with all that additional revenue, then governments are supposedly collapsing because of the debt that's created, and there's no possibility of repaying those debts. More of that later. Consider how outrageous it is that we are still reliant on a technology that is 140 years old for our main means of transportation. Every other form of technology is advancing on a logarithmic scale, and yet we're still reliant on a technology that's 140 years old. But you need to know a little bit of history, and I'm not going to have the time to go into all of it tonight, but let me just sow a few facts with you. Henry Ford was told to stop building the electric car by John D. Rockefeller in 1896. In 1896, there were 2,500 vehicles registered in New York City. It wasn't the metropolis it is today. Of those 2,500 vehicles, 1,800 were electric vehicles. The Rockefellers, of course, owned Standard Oil, and they needed to sell oil. They started buying up the trams, the electric trams in all of the cities around the US, and then shutting the trams down, so that people had to buy buses, or local authorities had to buy buses, and people bought petrol-driven vehicles, thereby creating the petrol-driven economy. In 1973, the peak oil believers believe in the Marion King-Hubbard hypothesis. It was brilliant, brilliant. Marion King-Hubbard, by the way, was one of the founding members of the Club of Rome. Kissinger used that hypothesis to hype the price of oil by 400%. In 1973, to create the petrodollar, to create the global economy. That was the birth of the global economy, 1973, a 400% increase in the price of oil. He who controls the supply of oil, of course, controls the price, which was the primary, or one of the primary purposes for invading Iraq, and it's one of the primary purposes for invading Libya. And the invasion of Libya was brilliant, absolutely brilliant, because those of us who knew what was going on said right from the outset that the Arab Spring was a contrived event. It was contrived to create a smokescreen, because Libya was always the ultimate goal. Not just because of its oil reserves or its water reserves, but also because, just like Saddam was trading oil in euros, Gaddafi was about to start trading oil in gold dinar. And by the way, the UN were about to release a document on January the 4th this year, which effectively praised Gaddafi as a model leader in the Arab African world. How quickly that changes. But let me tell you what the real issue is. The real issue has nothing to do with peak oil, nothing to do with climate change, although climate change may come and bite us in a way that we haven't even considered yet. But the real issue is reservoir stimulation. Reservoir stimulation. And this was an issue that I was trying to flag up to Transition Town 5 and 6 years ago, when I was telling them peak oil was a complete crock, which was, of course, the point at which Transition Town decided to demonise me. They've even attempted to label me as a Holocaust denier, because I refused to buy into the peak oil construct. Let me tell you what the real issue is. The real issue is reservoir stimulation, otherwise known as fracking. Anybody here heard the term fracking? Right, fracking is now illegal in France. France is the first country on the planet to make fracking illegal. Let me show you a 30-second clip of the effects of fracking in the US.
Just give it a second. Whoa.
Okay, that's a short clip from an absolutely stunning film, a documentary produced last year by an excellent young documentary maker called Josh Fox, and the film is called Gasland. Gasland. Go watch it. Recently, fracturing operations in the northwest of England were shut down, allegedly because it triggered an earthquake. A relatively minor earthquake, but nonetheless an earthquake. Whether it did or it didn't, I don't know. But it is wonderful news that it's been shut down. The fracturing operation, when I was working with Schlumberger in the United States, this operation gave me many sleepless nights, mainly because I couldn't get the information. I could not get from my own company the information of what was in the fracturing fluids, because I was told it was proprietary information, proprietary knowledge. And Schlumberger have developed the one-day, four-stage frac job, which by definition means that they're working incredibly fast, but it also means that they're not really having the time to monitor the effect of what they're doing. What fracturing is, it's opening up gas wells in shale geology. Now, for many years, the fracturing was done by pumping water, salt water, under very high pressure. Then somebody realized that if you actually introduce cocktails of extremely corrosive and toxic chemicals, you can actually speed up the process. Now, in theory, you pump the liquids down there under enormous pressure. It's also pumped with sand or with other materials that keep the rock fractures open to enable the gas to flow. But there's no control over what you're opening, so the gas gets into the water table. And in the US, outside of the cities, a hell of a lot of people's water comes from natural water wells. And as you'll see in Josh Fox's film, almost everywhere where gas wells are being fracked, people's water is being poisoned. So once it gets into the water table, of course, it means that the water is no longer usable. People are getting incredibly sick from ingesting or even washing in contaminated water. But of course, it then gets into the subsoils and into the soils. So ultimately, you poison the food chain. This is part of the depopulation agenda. You know, these guys don't work in short timescales. These guys work in multi-generational cycles. And they work on the basis that, you know, the vast majority of people, even if they have the inclination, don't have the time to actually research this, and they'll keep people focused in very, very short timescales, like maybe the next salary check or the next major sports event or the next soap or whatever it is. But they'll keep people away from the longer term agenda. Fortunately, more and more people are waking up to that. I think that's a great place to stop, actually, because, you know, the whole issue of the contrived agenda is very, very significant. And in the next half, we're going to really bring it up to speed, and I'm going to introduce you to some information surrounding the events in Japan, Fukushima, in Germany, in Norway, that I'm sure that the vast majority of you haven't been able to put together. Now, I don't claim any sort of unique insight here, but I have simply devoted the last 12 years of my life to researching the deep geopolitical agenda. I look for patterns, and these guys are not particularly creative. You know, once they've got a pattern to work one time, I can be pretty much certain that they're going to use the same pattern again. And the good news is that when I first started doing this more than a decade ago, there was probably only a handful of us, you know, dotted around the planet, and we didn't really have any connectivity. Today, thanks to the internet, that connectivity has been enhanced dramatically. So my job actually today is a lot easier because I get information coming in from many, many different sources. Now my job is to sort out what's good information and what's complete junk. And there are incredible disinfo agents out there. Has anybody here heard of Sorchefal? Sorchefal? Well, that's a guy by the name of Daniel Booth. And I've got to tell you, I read all of the crap that he pumps out because quite often contained within the 90% of disinformation is an absolute nugget of truth. And the key issue is picking out those nuggets of truth. I mean, you'll never find me reposting or requoting Daniel Booth, that's for sure. But sometimes there's a piece of information in there which then when I go and dig through other sources proves to be extremely valuable. But let me tell you, this is not all gloom and doom. It's not all gloom and doom because, as Steve said, right, everyone here has probably been through a very, very significant personal upheaval sometime over the last, what did Steve say, 10 to 12 years? Well, when we go through deep personal trauma, that's when we are truly living. That's when we have the opportunity for real personal growth. We have an opportunity to absolutely probe to the deep inner depths of our psyche. And we have to embrace these traumas, these dramas, as the opportunities that they are. Because if we don't, then guess what? We're probably going to have to do it all over again. But once we start to embrace those opportunities, these dramas, these traumas that come and kick us where it hurts, you know, whether it's health issues, financial issues, relationship issues, career issues, whatever, they normally come out of left field. Well, actually, they don't, but we've ignored all the signs leading up to them, so when they do come, it does feel as though they've come right out of left field. Well, that's what's occurring right now. Instead of it being on the microcosm, which of course the personal experience is, this is the same thing on the macrocosm. So consider the possibility, as outrageous as it sounds, consider the possibility that those individuals, those groups of people who are perpetrating what appears to be an outrageous agenda, an agenda that certainly does not appear to be benign or benevolent towards humanity, consider the possibility that it's actually creating the most incredible opportunity for humanity to evolve to the next level. And without that, we may not actually be able to take that opportunity. So everybody in this theatre, this global theatre, is playing a very, very major role right now. And it's really a question of whether or not people actually voluntarily wake up to what's occurring, or whether they have to wait to be seriously slapped around the side of the head. And our goal, our challenge, is to try and encourage as many people as possible to see what's going on and to start taking responsibility, because that's what we're not doing right now, and that's what gives these individuals, whose agenda is certainly not benign or benevolent, that's what gives them the opportunity to pursue with their agenda, because we don't want to take responsibility. So on that note, let's take a 20-minute break, and I'll catch you back here at 10 to 10. Thank you. Are there some house lights? Or is this it? This is it. Okay. Okay, so I can't even tell whether you come back.